You're listening to Faith in Healthcare, the CMDA Matters podcast. Here's your host, Dr. Mike Chupp.
Welcome, friends, to Faith in Healthcare, where we continue to explore the issues that matter most to Christian healthcare professionals. Whether you're in healthcare, married, or otherwise connected to someone who is, or you're simply interested in how God is working through Christ's followers in patient care and beyond, we're so glad that you're here. In this episode today, we're joined by Dr. Nigel Cameron. He's a theologian, bioethicist, and author of the new book, Dr. Koop, The Many Lives of the Surgeon General. It's the first major biography of Dr. C. Everett Koop, one of the most influential and complex figures in American medical history. Before he became a household name, Dr. Koop revolutionized the field of pediatric surgery. He pioneered the NICU, the neonatal intensive care unit, and helped shift medical culture to value every life, including children with disabilities. Then later, as Surgeon General, he became known for his bold approach to public health, his unexpected compassion in the wake of the HIV/AIDS crisis, and his unwavering pro-life convictions, shared in part through his partnership with Francis Schaeffer in the landmark film series, Whatever Happened to the Human Race. Nigel's book is the result of years of research, hundreds of interviews, and thousands of documents, capturing not only Koop's public influence, but also his spiritual convictions, his personal struggles, and his enduring legacy. From his groundbreaking medical work to his role in actually forming CMDA's International Alliance and confronting the moral and medical crises of his time, Dr. Koop's life is a powerful portrait of purpose and courage, as well as conviction. And his life shows how one man's faith actually helped shape the course of American medicine as well as public policy. So let's dive in. Well, today on CMDA Matters, I am delighted that all the way from Brussels, my guest is Mr. Nigel Cameron, who's a self-described theologian and bioethicist, and the bioethics came along later in his career, was very involved in the start of the Center for Bioethics and Human Dignity out of Trinity, and developed a friendship with a very important American doctor back in the day, and as a result has written a wonderful biography of a very famous American physician and one of our former Surgeon Generals, and CMDA member leader, C. Everett Koop. So welcome to the program, Nigel Cameron.
Great to be here. Thank you, Mike.
So I've looked through some of your works, what you've published in the past, and it's somewhat eclectic. And just before we get started, you said someone's now joked that you're a medical historian since you've tackled one of our famous American doctors. So how did you get interested in writing a biography about C. Everett Koop?
Well, it is an interesting question. Koop passed back in 2013. He literally was 96. And I think one of his problems with his reputation is he could faded slowly, and he didn't just sort of, go. And I was thinking about him. I mean, people pop into your head, just before the pandemic, just before COVID. And I thought, well, there must be a biography. It would be great to read up, So I got onto Google, and I mean, absolutely nothing. And the problem with biographies is people can write them for a long time, sort of underground. So I thought, whom could I connect with? Just who would know if somebody's writing about it? So I pinged Tony Fauci. I'd met Fauci in the past once or twice, and I knew he and Koop were really very friendly. And it was just before COVID, and Tony, as a complete workaholic, was still doing his own email. So I get this immediate reply. I think after COVID started, I'd never got through to him. But he said, no one's talking to me about CHIC. And he said, well, let's have a conversation. So I had a number of interviews with Tony Fauci. But yeah, so I thought, well, remember, and a more, if you like it, another way of looking at this is Chick Koop, I mean, he was a believer and he was a major public figure. Harold O.J. Brown, whose name some of your listeners will know, one of the most astute Christian thinkers, he said that Koop was the most important evangelical in American public life since William Jennings Bryan.
Wow.
Koop was an important man. I did not want somebody writing about him for a Christian publisher, which one could do, and God bless him. Nor did I want a secular writer writing about him who really wouldn't understand his faith at all. And in fact, somebody almost did just after I started, and I put them off. I thought someone used to write about him as a public figure, but somebody who understands his faith. And I'm very pleased it came together with the university press, who were very happy for me to do that. So that's a slightly long answer to your question.
Sure, thank you. And you developed a personal relationship with Chick Koop. And by the way, for our listeners' benefit, how in the world did he come to be known as Chick when his name is C. Everett Koop?
Well, it's kind of, chicken coop. I mean, it really is a bad joke. But interestingly, both his father and grandfather apparently were called Chick when they were kids and then got rid of it when they went to school. Chick, our Chick, only got called Chick first in college. Before then, he was known as Everett or Ev, and the family still call him Ev. He didn't like this, and he told me the story. He said he went to med school. I said, great, I can get rid of Chick. And he said he was in some sort of, thing at the beginning of his first year of freshman at medical school, some ceremony or, registration. And right across the hall, a guy yells out, "Hey there, Chick Koop!" And he said, I knew it was over. So I decided I could just be called Chick. And back in 85, I was in Edinburgh in Scotland running a project which involved lectures on medical ethics, bioethics issues. And I'd heard of the great man, mainly through Baby Doe and his work as a pediatric surgeon. So I just wrote him a little letter. In the old days, you had to put a stamp on it and put it in the mail. And I get a call. "Hey, this is Chick Koop." And he said, "This government owes me vacation time. And I love England." I was actually in Scotland, but, And so a year later, he came over and we spent a week together and we became friends.
Wow. Well, he's the man, Dr. C. Everett Koop. There's just so much that you can pin to that character, to that reputation. Nigel, I was a missionary in Kenya at a mission hospital for 20 years as part of my career. And when visiting the hospital's founder, was looking through his guest book, which he loved to keep right from the first month he got there in Kenya back in 1959. And there on his list of guests in his home was C. Everett Koop. And I'm like, is this the Dr. Koop? Dr. Story, the founder, said, yes, Chick Koop came and saw our work here at Timbuk Hospital. So an incredible background and involvement with the Christian Medical Society back in the day. Over decades, I'm told by my predecessors, he was very involved.
He was very pally with Ray Knighton. And he was really quite involved in setting up, MAP that became MAP International. At the time when he was being interviewed, confirmed in the Senate, it was the second most important relief agency in the U.S. after the Red Cross. And he and Ray were buddies. At one point, they went out for 6 or 8 weeks and traveled all over Africa, doing surgery and researching for future projects. And that was very much the man he was back in the 50s as he, was making his career as a pediatric surgeon.
So of all the many things that he's known for, as you did research for this book and have followed stories about Dr. Koop, what are those things, whether they are in public health or healthcare policy, that have had a lasting impact, especially upon evangelicals?
Well, where do you start? Plainly, if you like, at one remove from public health, we have the abortion debate. And very few evangelicals today realize that back in 1973, most evangelical leaders thought abortion was a Catholic issue. It was like the Supreme Court banning contraception or saying everyone gets contraception. That was how they looked at it. It was a Catholic thing. Mm-hmm. And of course, back then also Catholics and evangelicals were much less friendly than they would be now. So Koop in 1973 was asked to give commencement address at Wheaton College. Famous Christian doctor, daughter is graduating, they give him a degree, and it helps him raise money and all the things colleges do. And he gives this absolutely thunderous attack on abortion. And way before his collaboration with Francis Schaeffer and so on later in the decade, so Koop was the most important person in getting evangelicals to be pro-life. Now that's one thing. You move into the public health agenda, and he is the most important person in getting the tobacco companies really on the rails, And they will say this. You read their records. They say it was Koop. Koop did this. He really has made it very difficult for us to maintain our argument that, the evidence is ambiguous and so on. Despite the fact that Koop's key sponsor in the Senate was Jesse Helms, who I described as the smoker's patron saint. And then, of course, we get AIDS. And The Reagan administration people had tried to avoid doing much about AIDS, and in the end asked Koop to write a report in '86. And it's partly, because Reagan himself got personally involved because of people he knew who were dying of AIDS. And Koop says, well, okay, if I have to do this, I'll do it. If it sits down with everybody who knows anything about it. And he's become very friendly with Tony Fauci. Now, Fauci, of course, is best known to us now as the guy who handled the COVID thing for the Trump administration. But, Fauci, infectious diseases, immunology, this is his thing. And he and Koop used to meet up in the evenings because, Koop had an official house on the campus in Bethesda of the NIH. There are sort of, grace and favor houses, special houses for certain officials. And he had one of these houses. And you could actually see it from Tony Fauci's office. Fauci's now retired. But so Koop would go home in the middle of the evening to have dinner and stop by Fauci's office. Fauci was a workaholic. He was always there till 10 at night. And they would talk about HIV/AIDS for year after year, 81, 82, 83. So when the president asks Koop to do something about this, and they all assume that the politico from the White House will all assume he will say this is a bad thing. It's about gay people. It's about, drug users. You just don't do it. They say, okay, Koop, write a report. And Koop sits down with everybody. And I've spoken to two key leaders of the gay and lesbian task force and the gay minority group who survived AIDS, God bless them. They both said they met with Koop. And they really couldn't believe their ears because he said, I want to hear all about this. I'm a doc. And they began talking to him. And he said, I do not like what you people do. But he said, God is the judge. I'm a doc. I'm going to save your life. And they said that is exactly what he sought to do. So he comes up with Public Health on AIDS, which not only was inclusive of their positions, and you haven't got to agree with everything he was recommending about sex education and so on and so forth, but which was intended, he said, famously he once said, I am the Surgeon General of the homosexuals and the heterosexuals. He saw himself as having been a God-given role to protect the health of people, whether he approved of them or not. And, of course, much discussion now about PEPFAR, which is the president's program for AIDS relief, this enormous multi-billion thing George W. Bush started, which is now falling apart, and revolutionized AIDS treatment in Africa. People have saved 25 million lives, that sort of thing. Well, Mike Gerson, who was a brother who was sadly departed now, who was George W. Bush's chief speechwriter. Mike said in the New York Times that this would never have happened if Koop hadn't basically, I don't know what term he uses, is sort of defanged the AIDS issue for Republicans. Yeah. It's a public health issue. It's not something about God punishing people who do bad stuff. Yeah. And therefore, the Bush administration was free to launch this huge campaign. Drunken driving and wife abuse and so on. This is all public health, said Koop, and I'm going to save your lives.
Well, I was on the ground in Kenya when PEPFAR hit, and I must say it was revolutionary and saw for 10 years a huddle of missionary doctors wondering, what are we going to do? Half our hospital has AIDS patients in the early to mid 90s. And PEPFAR did make a change. So it's interesting to hear that comment that C. Everett Koop was involved in setting the stage, because even when I come back to the evangelical church, supporting churches, strong biblical churches, it was hard to get them to accept even me giving a talk about HIV/AIDS in Africa because it was such a taboo topic. And yet this is now in the early 2000s. Just switching our conversation just a little bit, changing the direction. As a surgeon, I'm a general surgeon, and just to read your chapters about his training, the academic environment among the early pediatric surgeons, somewhat toxic in some respects, how you describe it. And the infant mortality rate was just staggering in the 1940s and 50s. And so obviously Koop, you write so well, Nigel, about how he influenced the development of the pediatric surgical subspecialty and the impact that had on infant survival and infant mortality.
Yeah, he was. I mean, if he'd had a heart attack after his retirement dinner, in the spring of 81, in some ways he'd probably be more famous now because people would have written biographers and so on. And he had this extraordinary impact in basically building pediatric surgery as a profession. he didn't start it. I mean, Ladd and Gross were the two godfathers of the profession back in the 1910s and 20s, and Koop studied with them and got to know them. But he professionalized pediatric surgery. It's said he was one of maybe the first 4 full-time pediatric surgeons. It is remarkable what you're saying. I mean, typically, surgery on infants was done by general surgeons. They did not like doing it because so many of the kids died. A major reason for that was because of anesthesiology.
Right.
I think Koop says somewhere that they didn't like putting them to sleep because they never knew whether they could wake them up. And so he worked very closely with a pioneering pediatric anesthesiologist, very closely with her for several years, developed techniques. They refused to publish some of their work because they were concerned that surgeons would try things out without being as careful as they were being. But this pioneering in Philadelphia in the 1950s had an awful lot to do with the success of pediatric surgery around the world, and also fighting for professional recognition for boards for pediatric surgeons, which he fought for over 20 years, and which finally, of course, were recognized. And I think we tend to think of Koop for other reasons because of the abortion debate, because of AIDS in public. But he was on the ground. I mean, on little things. I mean, it's very interesting. I spent probably more time than my publishers might have wished going into, what was going on within the pediatric profession. But I mean, he was the key person who stopped kids having their feet x-rayed in shoe shops, which I remember as a child in the 50s. He was a key guy behind that. Yeah. He was a key guy behind stopping people making cleansing fluids, putting perfume in them, which made kids want to drink them. Oh, I mean, he had a much wider role within the pediatric profession. I've read all the minutes, of the Pediatric Association. So it's important to recognize, one reason why I picked the title for the book, The Many Lives, is he had a complete life there before ever he got into public health, or even before he got into the abortion debate.
And yet, so I've got your book right here on my table, Dr. Koop, The Many Lives of the Surgeon General. I can't imagine how many thousands of hours that you spent in your research, and just some of the personal things I would have never known without reading your book about his loss of his son David in a rock climbing accident, and very much focused on relationships. You've said it just speaks very highly of the man that and international relationships. It shared with me this week that he had a big role to play in the meeting in Amsterdam, in which 12 nations of CMDAs, including the U.S. representatives, got together and decided we need an international body. And so was part of that formation of the International Christian and Medical Dental Association. Other personal anecdotes or things that you learned that were a surprise to you about the man?
My goodness, how many do you want? Well, in his teens, okay, so he was a tall kid. I mean, he was 6 foot something, because I think he was 6'1" finally, but he was 6 foot when he was 13, 14. So he had a friend who was a medical student, and who was at Columbia, and he would smuggle him into the school to watch surgery. And he would go in every week on Saturday mornings when nobody else was around. And the surgeons were all showing off and telling this medical student, he'd just pick up a white gown from a peg somewhere, and they're telling him all what they were doing. So when he was about 14, 15, he went home and he said to his mom, I mean, he has an adoring family. He was an only child. I want to do some surgery. So he would kidnap stray cats. And his mom was the anesthesiologist. And he would operate on these cats and take out parts that didn't matter, and this, that, and the other, and put an icing glass there to have a look and see what was going on. And he claimed that they were all fit and fine and sound and released again. I suspect Chick had a bit of he could exaggerate. But, I mean, over several years, he was learning surgery. He helped out at a hospital when he was in college. And the surgeon he was working with was very fond of him. And on one occasion, when he was in college, had him take somebody's leg off. I mean, he helped a bit, but he said, you're the guy. It's your operation. Wow. And then he gets married again when he's 93. His wife had died 3 years before. And neither of his sons, who were alive then, would go to the wedding. Yeah. So it wasn't all sweetness and light in the Koop family. But he got married again, and I become very friendly with his widow, who is still going strong in her 80s, Cora, and was a missionary, and is a most delightful person. And it was a great treat for me when she read the book, and she wrote back and she said, I think this was, you got it. This is Chick. I think you understand it. So that meant a lot to me.
Nigel, there's a movie, and maybe it's a book study as well, that reading your book makes me want to go back and experience it, because this happened when I was quite young. I'm too young to have experienced it personally, but his relationship with Francis Schaeffer and the development of the series, Whatever Happened to the Human Race, and how, just talk to our listeners a little bit about how instrumental that relationship, how critical that relationship with Francis Schaeffer, his time at L'Abri, Koop's time at L'Abri, in forming his own views and then coming out and changing the hearts and minds and thinking of evangelicals regarding the pro-life movement.
Yes, I discussed this in the book to a certain amount. I could, of course, have written much more about it. I think most people looking back on what happened on Schaeffer's role, because of course Schaeffer is much better known, at least within certain circles than Koop would be, religious circles. They see it as basically as Schaeffer's doing, and Koop was sort of supporting cast because he was the specialist. And it really isn't what happened. I mean, Koop actually met the Schaeffers way back early on, quite by chance or by providence, when one of the Schaeffer kids was having an operation at the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia. He met Mrs. Schaeffer, and Fran was not there at the time, and they began to connect, and he began to support their work. And actually, he was quite instrumental, he says, in the fact that they shifted. They were in Switzerland working for a mission, and they moved to a different canton, to the place where L'Abri was then established. And Koop was involved right from the start in their ministry back then, just back in the 40s and 50s. And then they kept in touch. And then they got together again in the 70s. Schaeffer had produced this series of movies about the history of civilization. And Koop said, well, maybe we could do something like this on these issues. And so he went over and he actually had a great conversation with Frankie Schaeffer, who now goes by Frank, and who is some people will know. He's now not quite the evangelical conservative he was then. And he has a podcast and so on. And so he's interviewed me for his podcast. And he was very helpful to me in talking about something of the background, the relationships. And one thing he says, as someone who's no longer would be an evangelical, he says, I think my dad and Koop, the two of them, they were better men than their theology. So make what you will of that. But he admired Koop. So Koop goes over there, and he's sitting around with Frankie, as he was then, who was, 20-some years old. And they come up with the idea for the series. Whatever Happened to the Human Race, infanticide, euthanasia, abortion, the whole thing is all tied together, exactly as Koop has been saying for years. And they go and sell this to Dad, to Francis Schaeffer, partly as a way of getting a job for Frankie to do. There's a lot going on here. And Frank said to me, well, Koop was thinking of basically this was his project, and he was going to do this. Maybe we could help. And he said, well, it's not going to work because we have all the contacts because they're through Dad. Dad was not sort of primarily interested in the abortion debate. And there's some abortion in his first series, but not a lot. And so there were various moving parts. And I think I got it right in the way I described this in the book. But they all collaborated and they produced the series, which is not remotely as successful as Schaeffer's earlier series was, because in the late 1970s, an awful lot of evangelicals were involved in abortion. And, I remember Koop saying to me once, we went to one church and we're going to show the movies. And the pastor said, well, I'm going to have you here, but it's all a bit embarrassing, he said, because my wife had an abortion. I mean, this was a very different kind of environment to the one people expect looking back. So they were together and they were very friendly. And in fact, there's some correspondence between them in Koop's files at the National Institutes of Health and elsewhere, which really display this friendship. And Betty Koop is writing, the Schaeffers there's family contact. Koop is offering to help them with all sorts of medical issues, serve as an advisor and make them good, make them contacts with the best people and so on. And then when Schaeffer is dying up at the Mayo Clinic, they have some big disagreements because Koop, he was, if you like, a fairly simple sort of Calvinist. His son died. God had planned this to happen. It's terrible for us. There were good reasons for it. That's why it happened. And he's saying to Schaeffer, well, you're going to die, and God has planned this, and, just get over it, and, God will get glory from your death. And Schaeffer is saying, no, this is the devil. This is terrible. Death is the enemy. And so they didn't see things quite eye to eye. But they were friends right up until the end.
Before we continue with this week's episode, here's a special announcement for you. Fall is full of upcoming 2025 CMDA conferences. The Women Physicians and Dentists in Christ Commission will be holding their annual conference September 4th through 7th, 2025 in Albuquerque, New Mexico at the beautiful Hotel Albuquerque, right in the heart of Old Town and the Rising Sawmill District. This conference is one of the very best ways to experience the belonging, support, and equipping that is at the heart of the WPDC ministry. CME is available, and we invite you to explore all the conference details and register today at wpdc.cmda.org. The 2025 Midwest Fall Conference is happening September 26th through 28th at the Maranatha Retreat Center on the shores of Lake Michigan. This gathering features speakers like Dr. Farr Curlin, Dr. Stephen Coe, and a special panel with Dr. Carl Truman. You can earn up to 6 CME credits, and there's a full children's program for kids 12 and under, making it a wonderful weekend for individuals or the whole family. Join us for the 2025 Northeast Regional Retreat, October 24th through 26th at Sandy Cove Ministries in Northeast Maryland. This year's theme is Faith Embodied, led by Dr. Stephen Coe, a pediatrician and preventative medicine physician at Mass General Brigham in Boston. Continuing education credit is available. First-time attendees can also find an additional discount code on the event page. Learn more about all of these events and register at cmda.org/events. Let's jump right back into this week's episode.
How do you think that Dr. Koop's faith and his worldview influenced his approach to public health initiatives during his time at Surgeon General? Those chapters from his Washington public policy years, intriguing, and listeners are going to have to just read your book on how much of a challenge it is for Dr. Koop, not used at all to public service and being in Washington, D.C., and found that the job was really ceremonial mostly by that point in time. And yet he made something of it. And how did faith guide him, strengthen him through those years with Ronald Reagan in Washington, D.C.?
Well, Chick would get up every morning at 4:30. And he was doing that into his 80s for coffee and for prayer and to begin the day. And certainly part of the key to this man, and I say this to interns and other people whom I counsel from time to time, it was simply his work ethic. He just worked extraordinarily hard. And that's to be remembered as you look at his achievements. Well, Chick there were some rather naive things about him. I mean, he was a very complex man, very complex and very, very smart. But there were some things he never quite understood. Politics was one of them. And he thought that when he was given this job in Washington, D.C., it was a kind of promotion, that he was being moved out of pediatric surgery into public health. And he was being given this career as the nation's top public health official because he was a great surgeon. Mm-hmm. And wasn't that terrific? And I think he never quite understood that wasn't the point at all. He was being given this job because he was the most famous anti-abortion physician in the country, and Reagan was paying off the evangelicals for voting for him, and paying them off with a job that didn't really matter very much in the government. I don't think Chick ever realized that, and God bless him for it. And it wasn't a bad thing. It was quite helpful because he thought it's a different.
He charged ahead, didn't he? Thinking that I'm going to make a difference.
He kind of Googled public health and say, okay, what do public health people do? Oh, okay, fine, I'll do all this stuff. Now, he had a lot more experience than people gave him credit for. He was setting up hospitals internationally and so on with the State Department when he was a pediatric surgeon. But he thought, what do I do in public health? And the first thing he decided to do was, I will not talk about abortion, which was absolutely extraordinary. Because I think a very good writer about him said, both sides thought this was an election day promise. He was just saying this to get the job. And the liberals all thought he would be campaigning against abortion, and the conservatives all hoped he'd be campaigning against abortion. But he said abortion isn't a public health issue. It's a moral issue. It's various kinds of issues. Nothing to do with public health. Well, okay, fine. You could make an argument either way. And he said, what is public health? And he was also saying to himself, well, he really got beat up in the confirmation process. And he was saying to himself, how can I redeem myself in the eyes of the press? Now, the one thing the Surgeon General, this little job was a tiny, tiny job left over. I mean, the history is bizarre. Until the mid-60s, the Surgeon General controlled the NIH, FDA, CDC. He controlled all this stuff. Mm-hmm. After the mid-60s, he had half a dozen staff and went around making speeches. And the one thing he had to do by law was sign an annual report on tobacco. He didn't write it. He didn't even supervise the guys who wrote it, but he signed it. And it gave him a little piece of, in the sun. He'd have his press conference. So he got so beat up by the New York Times, called him Dr. Unqualified. He got his own editorial in the Times, not a bad thing, Dr. Unqualified. The American Public Health Association went after him in the nastiest possible way. And some clever journalist decided to call him Dr. Koop.
That was rather amusing.
And that was clever. If you Google Dr. Koop, there's a bunch of doctors called Dr. Koop. Anyway, so, and it upset him. Chick really was pretty thin-skinned, despite all of his bombastic speeches. I mean, people involved in controversy don't usually get upset, they get mad. He got upset. Thought to himself, how can I push back? And once again, be this greatly important doctor, famous for, as he was, in pediatric surgery. And he said, my one chance is tobacco. So he puts enormous effort into presenting the report on tobacco at the beginning of 82. He'd only been in office a couple of months, 3 months, and dominated a press conference where it was launched. And I have in the book, it's really very funny. I read the press. I mean, the Washington Post, New York Times, front page coverage, paragraph after paragraph, Koop, 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 before ever his boss, who now runs everything, was even mentioned. And Koop said after that, the press was always on his side.
Mm-hmm. Well, Paul talks about the fact that we're all jars of clay. And when we read our Bibles, we realize that anyone who's ever pursued God is a jar of clay. And C. Everett Koop was a jar of clay. And multiple times throughout your book, you talk about his struggle with pride. And you also talk about the family relationships. You've already alluded to that briefly. So let's talk about maybe those Achilles heel of his life, his career. He certainly was of a generation of doctors that patient care, my career came first, and sometimes family takes a back seat. So just talk to our listeners just a little bit about that side of C. Everett Koop. And I don't know that today we see as many from that generation with that sort of leaving the family behind kind of work ethic as much as we did back in maybe the 40s, 50s, and 60s.
But there are things to learn. I mean, one thing I'd be asking myself is why do I do this? You were asking earlier. Basically, it was 4 years' work. 2 of those years very much full time. It's taken 6 years to do the whole thing, start to finish. So why do we do this? And it's partly, I think, biographies are wonderful ways of learning about what it means to be human.
Yes.
And how even great people and wonderful people, yes, they have feet of clay, Chick did. And there are things, I said I don't think he ever recognized he got the job because he was anti-abortion. I don't think he ever realized quite how different his family experience was to that of his own kids. He had these 4 kids, three boys and a girl. And he was a wonderful father, but he wasn't there every day. They would have a month in the summer all together. And he reckoned that was it. But plainly, it wasn't it. And it wasn't just his patients had to come first. I mean, for quite a time, the one day he was basically free was Sunday. After dinner on Sunday, lunchtime to dinner on Sunday, he would go out and work with a team of students on Skid Row in Philly, among the down and outs. He wasn't back until 1 a.m. sometimes. I mean, this is week after week after week, month after month. Nothing to do with his job as a pediatric surgeon. And as one of his best friends, who is still with us in Philly and who is now quite ancient, said to me, he just needed to be needed. He was that kind of guy. Mm-hmm. And you have to layer these things on top of each other. Now, I've had, coursing through my sort of psyche as I've written this book, each chapter I want to hand it to Chick. And I say, okay, here it is, sir. Is this fair? I mean, details correct, okay, fine, but is this fair? And as I've gone through the book, this has been and then the whole thing, Chick, is this fair? And so the final chapter in the book is a kind of assessment of his personality and his foibles and strengths and weaknesses and so on. And I sent that to half a dozen of his oldest and closest friends, not to family members, but I said, look, just give me an absolutely off-the-record private assessment of whether I've really got the guy right. And it was I had some very nice responses. And one or two people said, well, you're a bit too... Okay, so they added bits and so on. So in a sense, that final assessment was from people, some of whom knew much better than I did. But yeah, I mean, he became an absolute celebrity in the late 80s. It is a remarkable thing. I mean, Frank Zappa wrote a song about him. Elizabeth Taylor blew him kisses on television. I mean, goodness gracious me. This was an extraordinarily famous person for 3 or 4 years. And the problem with celebrity, of course, and I talked to a guy whose job is counseling people like the Kardashians when they get into trouble. This, off the record, totally. This guy, and he said, well, I told Chick, he said, I cannot bring back the 1980s. Celebrities go up and they come down. And Chick found that very hard. And in his 90s, a close friend would say to him up at Dartmouth, where he had retired, well, Chick, what are you going to do? He had a few years left to him and he had all sorts of interests. He was a collector and he had his family. He said, I just want to be Koop, the great man. He was no longer the great man. He was an old guy people had been forgetting. And his friend said to him, Chick, you're a has-been. You're a has-been. That word has-been. And he couldn't take it. And so Ken Larter, whom I quote in the book, was wonderfully helpful to me, who had been a nurse as well as a pastor, and who was one of the closest people to him, probably his closest spiritual advisor, we might say, in his last years. He said, and he said this publicly at the National Memorial Service, his last years were deeply depressed, despite his remarriage. And the wonderful thing about the remarriage, I mean, they were hammer and tongs. These two would fight, he and his wife. I mean, his first wife was very much the quiet, old-fashioned, Cora and he, hammer and... But Chick is on the phone to this old friend of his. He's the same guy who said he's a has-been. And he said, Chick was on the phone to me. And he was probably 94, 95. And he said, marrying Cora was my best decision in the second half of my life.
Wow.
So there was happiness and satisfaction there. But he was also depressed because he wasn't a great man anymore. And those of us who are, I'm in my 70s now, we're sort of winding down a bit, We've got to come to terms with the fact that this is a cycle here, and that you can have your day in the sun and then it gets darker. And the way to be content is to, deal with your sense of pride. And I don't think Chick ever managed to do that. And it's a very sad thing. But now in glory, one of the saddest things was he would beat himself up. He said to one friend in his final years, I wanted to rid the world of tobacco. And you see there the ambition, you see there the arrogance, you see there the sadness. Because he tried to do things he couldn't do, but he did the most incredible things. And he couldn't be satisfied just to do the most incredible things. And I think there's a lot there we can learn about ourselves.
So you're hinting at that certainly the Surgeon General's warning on every package of cigarettes. I was just wanted to ask, if you had to boil it all, what is the most significant lasting impact of Chick Koop's life, and whether that's in surgery or public health? You say the many lives, so maybe that's too difficult of a question to answer. But in terms of lasting impact, clearly those warning labels on cigarette cartons and containers. Would you agree that even though he didn't rid the world of cigarettes, that clearly has had an impact?
Well, he didn't start that, but he tightened the wording, and that he was very important for that whole movement to put the tobacco companies in their place. And of course, smoking rates in the US are down, around 10% among college grads, 2 or 3 among people with postgrad, 1. Basically, smoking is basically out of American public life, and he had a huge role to play there. But then you look at pediatric surgery and the thousands and thousands of kids. And the way, he was once introduced in Japan because he had a lot of Japanese, particularly through an evangelical Japanese who was the top pediatric surgeon there at the time, as the father of pediatric anesthesiology because of the importance of his collaboration early on. Probably, if you're looking numerically, it may well be PEPFAR because he defanged AIDS as an issue in the Republican Party. And it may well be that PEPFAR, which has saved, certainly tens, 20s, 30s, perhaps millions of lives in Africa. I don't know how you want to count. Very funny. So Chick, he always, he was not the most modest of men. He could be kind and generous, but he was never modest. And so I have the story there that he was 94 or 95, went to the wedding of a young friend of his, along with Cora. And he was introduced by I think this was the family the night before, the dinner the night before. And somebody was getting a nice whiskey and so on. And he was introduced by I think the father of the groom or the father of the bride. He said, well, we're so glad to have Dr. Koop here. He has saved millions of lives. And in his rather gruff way, Chick said, you're probably right.
Thank you for the labor of love that, Nigel, you have invested in this book in telling the tale of the many lives of a very wonderful, great man that's had an incredible impact. And again, as I was working with HIV/AIDS patients and seeing the dramatic change in the outcome of Africans' lives, and of course, there it's a heterosexual disease. It's not really in Africa a homosexual disease per se, gay disease. And so getting that message across, but the funding, and of course, we're struggling with that funding right now. And many of our listeners around the globe, we have over 25 countries of our members where people listen to this program, and we're doing the much we can to try to get those funds back into our mission hospital. So thank you, Nigel. Any parting words?
Well, I'll tell you one quick funny story. So when I was traveling around the UK with them, so we're having lunch with the faculty at a medical school at Birmingham or somewhere like that, I don't know. Because he was there, opened all the doors, and we had some fun stuff. And the dean was there with maybe 20 faculty around the table. And Chick says to somebody, could you pass the butter? Of course, back then, butter was absolute no-no stuff. It's a bit more complicated now, Pass the butter. And some cheeky faculty member says, excuse me, Dr. Koop, blah, 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 health. And Chick says, I am paid to give the American people health advice. I am not paid to set them an example.
Oh, dear.
That's Chick.
I didn't find that in your book. Is that just an extra anecdote for free?
Certainly in my head, and I can't get rid of it.
Well, Nigel, you shared with me as an intro when we connected today that you played a rather pivotal role in starting a bioethics master's program in Chicago. Could you briefly tell us about your involvement in helping to launch a program that so many of our members are familiar with and have gotten that master's?
Sure. Well, thank you. I was at the conference just, back in June. I'd not spoken for a while there. They invited me to speak, and it was a treat to be back there, particularly as there are big changes taking place. So back in 91, I was invited. I was called to go to Trinity. I was in Scotland then running a project which had involved Koop coming to give lectures in the mid-'80s, a theological project, but also with a sort of subset working on medical ethics. It was called then bioethics. We probably call it now. And this was much of my life. And I began a magazine called Ethics and Medicine, which is still going strong, Christian magazine on bioethics. And which in fact we published various of Koop's addresses in the magazine. I was called to Trinity to run their PhD program, which is a completely different sort of part of my life. I did that for a number of years, and I became the first provost of the university at Trinity and left after 8 years. As soon as I got there, I became aware of something that was rather strange. I mean, America is basically where bioethics became a thing back in the 60s, 70s, 80s. It's an American sort of invention as an academic discipline. And of course, America is also where you have such extraordinary, so many evangelical believers, and you have colleges and universities and so on, where you don't have anywhere else in the world. And I was just surprised that nobody has sort of plugged the two together. There was no bioethics programming in any of the sort of Christian schools, the evangelical schools. Some of the Catholic schools did, but they're more open general institutions. So I thought, well, maybe we could do something. So I raised a little money, as you have to do in America. I learned these things, raised a little money to have an event. And we pulled together people from CMDA, from Focus on the Family, several other organizations, a big funding organization, and several academics who were working in bioethics. There were only 15 of us. And we spent 36 hours, talking privately. Can we do something? And out of that came the plan for the Center for Bioethics and Human Dignity. And also, I was sort of take home. I mean, I was a department chair in systematic theology. I could just do stuff in the university myself. Then was able, as provost, to develop a graduate school so we could do a one-year MA, which you couldn't do then in a seminary, which was ideal. And you could do it in modular formats and so on, ideal for MDs. And a major concern I had was a lot of Christian MDs in their hospitals and other networks. I mean, they're chairing ethics advisory committees, more formally in terms of research ethics. Some of them are involved. And here we got a way to credential them so that they can be locked in, if you like, because everyone else is getting credentialed now through major secular institutions. So I went to see our president of Trinity, Ken Meyer, who was a very fine man, a wonderful school president. We've been with the Lord now for many years. And I said, President Meyer, I said, this isn't what you hired me to do, but I think stuff is going on and there are opportunities here. And he said, well, tell me more. And he was a sort of bit of a skinflint. I mean, you could never get money out of the guy. I said, I will get you MDs as alums if you let me do this. And his presidential eyes widened, because that's the way presidents think. And so then we were able to develop, we hired John Kilner, my old friend John Kilner, who is now retired, to run the center. And I was able to introduce a number of different programs into the school, including, after 3 or 4 years, the bioethics MA, which I know many, many have benefited from. And it's very satisfying for me to have seen and enabled many, many colleagues and friends, to get and do these things. But you have to have a sort of administrative yes to take the thing forward, and you've got to have a plan. And we put those things in place. I was there mainly to run the PhD program. I then became provost. I then worked with Chuck Colson, did some other things in Washington. But in the process, we released these programs, and I very much hope that they will be... I was hoping that there would be dozens of Christian schools would put up programs like this. But it's... let's just say evangelical Christians tend to be rather old-fashioned people. They like doing stuff the way they did it last year. And that's not the way the modern world is working. So thank you very much for the invitation to share a bit and to encourage others to jump in, because in the 21st century, this agenda is going to shape pretty much everything in our lives.
Of course it will. And I must say that it is bringing Protestants and Catholics together in a way, as you mentioned earlier, that we've not necessarily worked together before, and surrounding these bioethical issues. Also has been a part of bringing many of our organizations together in an alliance for Hippocratic medicine. I serve on the board of that organization with Catholic Medical Association, the Pro-Life OBGYN organization, and others. So thank you for the pivotal role and for explaining that to our listeners. And grateful that you took the time. I know the sun is setting on you there in Europe, and it's time for us to say goodbye, Nigel Cameron. Thank you.
Thank you very much. God bless.
Well, as I mentioned during my interview with Nigel Cameron about Dr. C. Everett Koop, I have a friend, a mentor, my predecessor at CMDA, who's with me today in the studio to talk about his encounters in personally meeting Dr. Koop. So welcome to the program today, Dr. Rudd. This is a great privilege for me.
Well, thank you, Mike. It's good to be with you.
So you've told me in the past these stories, but I'm just amazed by those stories, and I wanted our listeners to hear how you first encountered Dr. C. Everett Koop.
Well, my first encounter was actually when I was an OBGYN resident, late in the 70s. It was actually 1979. Francis Schaeffer and Dr. Koop were doing a 20-city tour presenting their material on whatever happened to the human race. Mm-hmm. And even though I was in residency, I managed to get away and go to the 2-day seminar. And by that time, I had developed a moral conviction that abortion was wrong and I couldn't do that. But I certainly wasn't ready to give an explanation or apologetic for that. Going to that seminar really opened my eyes and prepared me to explain why I had that conviction. So it was life-changing.
So what happened next? You got the conviction and you went back into OBGYN practice.
Well, I did. I finished my residency and, of course, I went on to do some fellowship work and then do some head of OBGYN training program kind of work. But those convictions followed me along, and I was able then to share those with my students and residents along the way, actually lead some to Christ along the way as well.
Well, the main story you told me once upon a time, I had to dig it out of you a little bit, but you actually personally met Dr. Koop after you became the Surgeon General.
Yeah, it was about 2 years after the seminar. Ronald Reagan had gotten elected to be president, and in early 1981, he had appointed Dr. Koop to be Surgeon General. And then later in that year, he had to go through his Senate confirmation. Well, I guess I was aware of that. Maybe I was, I'm not sure. But that was the year, too, that I had received the Gorgas Medal from the U.S. government for achievement in preventive medicine. So there was a big convention in November of that year in which I was going to receive that award. And what happened that very week is when the Senate finished its confirmation of Dr. Koop, and he surprised everyone by showing up. And of course, because he was there, they said, well, you need to do the award presentation. So I had not met him then until I was called up to stage, and we were standing behind the MC who was giving some background information. And I just leaned over to Dr. Koop and I said, thank you for having a significant influence on my life. And he sort of gave me a curious look. But then we went ahead with the presentation. And then after a plenary address occurred and the session was over, I was leaving the auditorium, and a big mitt caught me on the shoulder and spun me around. And he said, son, you can't say that to me without an explanation. Let me buy you a cup of coffee.
Oh, wow.
So we had a good chance to sit down and talk a little bit about how I had been influenced by he and Dr. Schaefer with that seminar series.
Gene, I want our listeners to know that Gorgas Award and that research project, for all of you surgeons out there, that was seminal research on the benefit, if I remember correctly, of prophylactic antibiotics. We do our timeouts, we make sure those antibiotics are in. Gene Rudd did some of the seminal research in OB associated with C-sections, were they?
Yeah, it was. Women that have long labors and are unable to deliver and then have cesarean section had an awfully high rate of infection afterwards. So I proposed some clinical trials, which got a lot of pushback from the infectious disease community because prophylactic antibiotics in those days was just taboo. Mm-hmm. And so I finally sort of modified the design of the studies to get some permission to do it. And we did different regimens of perioperative antibiotics, and it had an amazing effect on dropping the rate of infection. So it sort of turned the tide on the opinion about perioperative antibiotics.
Wow. Christians don't necessarily have to be lightweights when it comes to academics in terms of making a difference.
Yeah.
So let's fast forward. You're now Senior Vice President of CMDA starting in 94, 95. Dr. Koop's still around. So talk about his interface with CMDA.
Well, he had a long time been a member. In fact, he was strategic in helping to start the International Christian Medical and Dental Associations. But I knew he had spoken for some of our local chapters and student groups and things like that. So when we scheduled or organized a national student conference in the late 90s, it may have been 98, 99, somewhere in there, invited Dr. Koop to come be the keynote speaker, and I had the privilege of hosting him during that time. So we had a little time to visit and reminisce over meals and coffee. But what was so impressive was not reminiscing about the Gorgas or the, whatever happened at the Human Race Seminar. What was really impressive to me was the fact we could just sit down as brothers in Christ and talk about the faithfulness of God in our lives.
Wow.
And that was a time I cherish.
Well, one generation commends your works to another,
Absolutely.
David says in Psalm 145. Yeah. And it just makes me think, I wonder who God is going to raise up in this generation coming up that are in training or just early practice that will be a future C. Everett Koop.
Yes, and it also is a reminder to you and me, that we have an obligation to try to pour our lives into that generation.
Wow. Well, since interviewing Nigel Cameron and hearing about that, I've never seen the video series with Francis Schaefer. I'm challenged to go back, and I hope it's still available. I assume it is.
Well, the book is, I'm sure.
Okay. Thank you, Gene, for joining me today.
Thank you, Mike.
Thank you to both of our guests today, Dr. Nigel Cameron and Dr. Gene Rudd. What an extraordinary life that Dr. Koop led. It was powerful to hear both from Nigel's biography and from Gene's personal testimony how deeply Koop's faith impacted so many lives in public policy, in medicine, and in the hearts of those that he mentored. Dr. Koop was far from perfect, feet of clay, I think I heard Nigel say, a complex man with deep ambition, genuine faith, and an unrelenting desire to make a difference. As Dr. Nigel Cameron shared, his legacy is layered from pioneering advances in pediatric surgery to shaping national policy on AIDS and tobacco, to boldly confronting abortion at a time when so many evangelicals were still silent. More than a Surgeon General, Dr. Koop, well, he was a brother in Christ, a longtime member and supporter of CMDA, and he was a global advocate for life as well as human dignity. His example reminds us that we're called not only to practice excellent medicine, but to bring truth and compassion into the hardest cultural conversations, even when it costs us something. If you'd like to learn more about Dr. Nigel Cameron's biography on Dr. Koop, you can check out today's show notes. And to learn more about the wide range of resources we offer at CMDA to support you and your calling, from the CMDA Go mobile app for community and event access, to nearly 400 online courses available through our Learning Center. Just visit us at cmda.org. You'll also find a faith-based bookstore, our quarterly CMDA Today magazine, and nearly 90 bioethics position statements on all kinds of issues, the cutting-edge issues of our day. And you'll find much more, all designed to help you live out your faith with excellence and compassion throughout your entire professional journey. Well, if this episode encouraged you, please consider sharing it with your colleagues, your church community, or anyone who's navigating recovery or spiritual renewal. And follow the podcast on social media to stay connected. Well, next week, I'll be joined by CMDA's new president. He's a family physician, Dr. Omari Hodge, as he shares his own powerful journey of calling, mentorship, and a bold faith in medicine. From generational shifts and growing diversity to the greatest risks and most exciting opportunities that are facing Christian healthcare professionals today, you don't want to miss this conversation. I want to thank you again for listening to Faith in Healthcare, the weekly podcast from CMDA, where our mission remains the same: bringing the hope and healing of Christ to the world through committed Christ followers in healthcare. That's what matters to us at CMDA. As we step into this new chapter, our prayer is that each episode reminds you that you are not alone, friends, that your faith, it matters more than ever. Your work matters, and together we are part of something so much bigger. May you recognize this week that our Lord is with you and that He is for you to do His good work. Thanks for listening, and we will see you next time, Lord willing, on Faith in Healthcare.
Thanks for listening to Faith in Healthcare, the CMDA Matters podcast. If you would like to suggest a future guest or share a comment with us, please email cmdamatters@cmda.org. And if you like the podcast, be sure to give us a 5-star rating and share it on your favorite social media platform. This podcast has been a production of Christian Medical and Dental Associations. The opinions expressed by guests on this podcast are not necessarily endorsed by Christian Medical and Dental Associations. CMDA is a nonpartisan organization that does not endorse political parties or candidates for public office. The views expressed on this podcast reflect judgments regarding principles and values held by CMDA and its members and are not intended to imply endorsement of any political party or candidate.